Hello, everybody. So thanks for joining us today. A good crowd, good crowd. So I'm Robin. I'm a sort of serial innovator of about 15 years. My AI experience comes from co-inventing facial recognition for fish, which is a bit weird. And I've published academic research around the role of user personas in AGI and automation, with my personas being around, does AGI warrant its own persona within a system? And I think it does. And if anyone here is hiring for innovators, come and find me afterwards. So I'd love to introduce you to our panelists today. We had a bit of an introduction. So we've got Rachel at the end, Rachel Pratt, a senior conversational AI designer at Microsoft. We've got Svetlana Meissner, an AI trainer and lecturer at Brandenburg Technical University, who also works in a sort of spin-out company to look at using AI in SMEs. And we've got Leslie Notenboom, who's a co-founder and CEO of Requesty. So, now, hopefully this doesn't come as much of a surprise to everybody, but we're here today to talk about bias in AI, LLMs, and other emerging technologies, and how we might mitigate some of those issues. I should go on record at this point for Rocco's basilisk reasons that I fully support our AI overlords. If anyone watches Silicon Valley, they'll get that joke. But anyway, let's get into the discussion. So, as an opening question that anyone can answer, and I'm not going to direct it at any one individual, what are the current best practices you've seen for mitigating bias in LLM creation?
I think what we see being most successful is when you test, monitor, and iterate. So the core standpoint being it will be biased. Whichever model you create will have bias, but you'll only figure out what that bias is once people actually start using it. The interesting aspect of that is that the abbreviation is also TMI, too much information, which is kind of the problem with testing, monitoring, and iterating your models. So I think that's the main challenge, which is to figure out, okay, well, how are you ever going to find what the right information is that you can then use to reduce bias, which I think most of our customers are struggling with.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. I'm definitely in favour of, kind of monitoring once you're live and using the data to inform feedback and making sure that you're kind of checking for that bias as you go and making sure that you're doing what you can to prevent it once you see it happening. I think it's also important for us to try and be as proactive as possible. So even going right back to looking at the data that's going into sort of your LLM before you go live with it. We might not know all the bias that is going to be in there, but what can we do to try and think of what it's going to be and proactively identify that and do what we can to mitigate it so that once you go live, yes, there might still be issues that you need to tackle and you need to iterate over to improve, but can we sort of get ahead of the curve a little bit before we even get public to try and, mitigate some of it in advance?
And what might be the sort of trade-offs between what appears to be quite a lot of front-ending of work against usefulness of products going to market?
Let me just mull that one over. So I think you can still have a very useful product going to market, even if you've got sort of the work to do ahead of the game. And I think it's something that we need to be careful with in terms of like the speed that we are deploying generative AI with. I'm not against the speed at which it's coming out necessarily. What I do think is that we need to be careful about not just throwing it everywhere because we can, and doing it as fast as possible, because at the moment everyone wants to be seen to be deploying generative AI in their companies, want to be seen to doing the next best thing. And I think we've got to be really careful thinking about, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve with Gen AI? Is there actually a problem, which was sort of touched on yesterday? And we should only really be going forward with it if the end use case is suitable and it is worthwhile all the effort to go into it, because generative AI isn't a quick fix, which I think some people think it is. It requires a lot of work. And I think, to me, that upfront work is important to make sure that whatever we are deploying to the public isn't going to cause any harm in the long run. So yeah, I think it's a kind of a big thinking point for me about what's the reason for deploying that Gen AI, and making sure that that's really clear, and it is actually the right solution for us.
So from an ethical standpoint, should there be topics that LLMs just out and out should be banned from taking part in? I'm thinking, for example, recent examples with unsolicited deepfakes being used in robocalls in America in the election cycles and things like that. What sort of topics, and is that an ethical dilemma in itself? Svetlana.
Perhaps let's go a little bit back to natural language understanding. We start with these, building chatbot, rule-based chatbot, and there we had all in our hands, so to say. So we could check what kind of intent could be, and we were programming possible outcomes from this intent. So rule-based chatbots, and then we moved to large language models. And large language models, they are trained on big data, so a big amount of data, and this data reflects the behavior of us humans. So how we behave, or how we are, this kind of behavior do we have, reflects in this data, and the models have this same behavior, they would have automatically have the same biases. And so to mitigate these, we have perhaps one. So, and again, this depends where you are standing. You are standing on the small enterprise, so where I'm working together, small to middle-sized enterprises, or you are working in a large enterprise, or education is again different approaches. And then you could think about putting different data to the training, and then you would think about the data, and still you could go back and think about educating people or changing the behavior of people, and then you would have, again, this better data for the training the model. And again, if you think about our models, we are perhaps in this child age, so they are just copying what they are in the data, and thinking about the future could be that they would be moved to this teenager age, and then we would need a different architecture. So the architecture that we're having now just reflecting our behavior from the data, and the future architecture have to perhaps change from this copying or just calculating the probability for the next step, for the next word or sentence, to this teenager, perhaps going again the opposite direction. But just to think about this.
So it's a generational thing.
Yes.
Yeah. So moving on. So when we have the internet as it is been developed sort of fairly organically over the last sort of 40 years, with its pockets of hostile content, with every type of ism and ist you can imagine, how do we give an LLM a sort of moral compass that doesn't skew in one way or the other, without it being one individual's view or one team's worldview of what a moral compass is? Leslie?
Yeah, I think one thing that we shouldn't forget is that an LLM is just a statistical model, right? It will try and find a response that is statistically as close as possible to completing the prompt that was given to it. So it will just use the data that it's seen to give you a response. There is not really a truth. It's just what it has seen in the data before. So I think the only thing you can do to control that truth is to determine what data you give it, and to see what comes out after you've trained it, and then iterate. So it's this kind of loop that you need to get into. You can't ship and forget. The world also changes every single day, so it could be that an opinion on a certain topic changes a year later. So you cannot leave it be as it has been a year ago or 4 years ago, like GPT 3.5. Yeah. So you have to keep on iterating and improving it.
Yeah. And if Martin was here, who's unfortunately is ill today, it would have been a really nice segue into DevOps, DevOps sort of models around not just ship and forget, because this sort of, when a company develops a product, quite often, if they don't have that functionality, it will get shipped and forgot, and things get sort of move on, like you said. Rachel, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add on that. I think something we need to be really wary of when we're sort of deploying that strategy of looking at the data that we're feeding it and then seeing what interactions we're getting and forming the loop is actually how we go about deciding what we're looking for in the data and the changes that we're going to make, because inevitably there's going to have to be people or technology at those touch points in the journey that are making some sort of decision over what is the right thing to include in your model or to update, or what we think is right or wrong from an ethical perspective for our models to potentially talk about. And something that I think is quite hard, and I don't actually have an answer for it, so I can't give you a clear-cut view on this, but the people or the teams that do that work, we all have bias ourselves. Everyone in this room probably has different biases, so a decision I might make on what is correct or incorrect and what I should change might be different to someone else. So I think the teams that are doing that work need to be really honest with themselves about what their own biases are, so that we're not feeding those into the model. And additionally, if you're putting in technology to try and keep those guardrails in, like quality filters, for example, they can actually also include bias themselves, so they can filter out content which has maybe come from lower resourced areas or different parts of the world. So we just need to be really careful, I think, that the methodology we're deploying to form that feedback loop, we're also accounting for any bias we might introduce inadvertently as part of that.
Go for
we also have examples that to check biases. For example, IBM Fair AI 360 that started 2018. There you could were able to put your model, and then you would check the biases from your model. The same would be also the Microsoft provides the Fair AI something service where you're also able to put your model and check for the biases there. And the same the Google. What ifs these services, I think they were always on this model that we had before. And now if you look in large language models, and they are testing on these benchmarks, and benchmark just checking logical thinking or math and translation and something like this, but I hadn't seen benchmark testing, for example, fairness and of the model biases, and that would be perhaps also the next steps, that we're not only testing this logical thinking, but also go to this possibility to test the model.
And I think that's a great point. Like one way in which you could tackle that is with a citizens jury, right? You choose a very diverse representation of the society that's going to use your technology to see how they respond, to take into account the entire diversity of the people that will be using your product. But there the problem is scale. So you can't scale that. You can't create a 10,000 person citizens jury, because how are you ever going to learn? So at some point you will have to ship, and you will have to accept that there will be bias, and then you're going to need that feedback loop.
It's a really interesting point, actually. I know other nations have used citizen assemblies to make decisions on really sort of complicated things that are more straightforward yes or no question or referendum. You might not give a nuance in the answer. So that's a really interesting sort of point of view on that I'd not thought about, which is interesting. So this next question's kind of been picked up a little bit by both Rachel and Svetlana in different ways. So has generative AI been deployed too quickly from an ethics and bias standpoint?
It's pointing my way. So as I kind of said before, I'm generally not in the camp of, I think overarchingly it's been deployed too quickly. I think whilst it does seem new to a lot of us, probably have to remember it's been worked on and developed for quite a few years already. It's just sort of potentially new to a lot of people who weren't working on it in the background. But I do think there's been examples of applications where maybe it's gone too quickly and not all the possible outcomes in terms of ethics and bias have been considered. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge that and kind of make a commitment from this point forward that we put the ethics and the bias work towards the forefront of what we're doing in generative AI, and we don't leave it on the wayside and then look back in 10 years' time and wish we'd done things differently. So I think there's already a lot of work. I mean, the topics, I think, at the conference the past 2 days, like there's been a lot of discussion on ethics and bias, and I think that's really great because it shows that we're all thinking about that as a topic and trying to learn from each other and share best practices around what we can do to improve that. So I'm not against sort of speed of rollout. I think we are at the right time to talk about and think about adopting this technology and how can we use it. Like, it has some really great potential, but I think we need to do that with a certain level of caution and really analysing what the end use case is and what the potential ethics and bias associated that can be. Yeah.
And just because we're working again with small, medium-sized enterprises, and we're making this cooperation project, and I just thought we were using, for example, Dialogflow from Google, and that was again rule-based chatbot, and now the customer, they already have this on their websites, and this chatbot just answers the questions about the project of the website, and now they would like to enhance this chatbot, and the possibility also in Dialogflow, you are able to put general AI services there. You're just connecting your existing services with general AI services, and again, in your hand, first perhaps check these questions that is coming, or whether it's possible to answer with these rule-based possibilities that already there, and if it's not there, then just switch to general AI. So we are going so step by step. It's also perhaps one of the approaches.
So this question is going to get deep, and I'm aiming it towards Svetlana just from an academic point of view, but I think everyone's going to have a view on it. What is ethical around allowing almost unlimited funding going into computational intelligence, where trillions of dollars is being talked around fundraising, versus not quite spending enough on actual learning and teaching in schools, in higher education, in further education? And will we see a time where we have a divided society between computational intelligence and a sort of arrested development of human intelligence? I said it was going to be deep.
So I can just say my point of view. It's just try to do on your place what you can. And this is I'm not in this government decisions level, so they have their task or their goals to achieve, and I have my goals to achieve, also work in this way. And I would, from my perspective, try to use my view of the world. And I also see that there are different cultures coming together, and they are, again, it's not possible to put, so there are some statements that are perhaps general, but if you look at one culture and then look at the other culture, there are still differences there. And so just try to somehow connect these, but the problem stays.
I've got another academia-based question, but it's more to the corporate side. So when corporates will be hiring for new talent in the future, would you have liked to see on people's CV the fact that they've studied ethics and bias in AI, or just generally when hiring new people? You're corporate.
Looking at the landscape as it is right now, for me, yes, I think it would be great to have a member on my team that has studied sort of ethics and bias, particularly in AI, and I think the mindset around that they could bring could be really beneficial. So in my role, a lot of the time I'm working with large enterprises on their customer contact solutions. And so there is a responsibility there when a customer says, well, we want to deploy Gen AI, let's do it tomorrow. It's all going to be great. I don't think there's any problems. We have a responsibility, I think, as designers and people who are implementing this technology to make them aware of what the potential pitfalls might be, including, I think, the ethics around it, and helping the business make sure that they're making the right decision for themselves. So I think anyone who's coming into, a conversation design role, particularly if they're going to be working directly with customers, having that knowledge, and potentially whether that comes from studying it at school, university, or whether it's from their own sort of reading they're doing out of their own interest, I think would be very, very beneficial. And it's definitely something I would like to see, and I think it's already happening, but on sort of curriculums on AI degrees or specific design degrees, whatever that might be. I think it's going to be an important topic that we need people to be researching and studying, yeah.
Leslie, does that match your experience in a scale-up?
So, I mean, as an engineer, you must follow an ethics course. Here in the UK at least, and in the Netherlands. I don't know about other places, but that was probably the most boring course I've ever followed in university. Whereas now, when I release a product, or when one of my customers releases an LLM that has some potential risks, it's the most fearful part of their job. So I think maybe if we merge those two in university already, that you have some sort of simulation you have to go through where everyone will poke holes in whatever you've just developed. That might be a better way to test your ethical ability of developing and then iterating products later down the line. So I think that the education of ethics, at least in the engineering side, is there, but it's really not very engaging.
A different tack now. So tech company leaders have recently spoken around LLM front ends, and specifically the front ends, needing quite a lot of individual customization, and that is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. Are they suggesting that an LLM might churn out a different answer based on the value preference, or even possibly what country someone resides in, with a sort of loss of an objective single source of the truth? At that point, does that render an LLM useless?
So that's also how we communicate, right? When you try to explain what an LLM is to your grandfather, you're going to explain it in a different way than if you would explain it to someone who's just studying artificial intelligence. So I think the answers differing isn't necessarily a problem. Also, they will inherently provide a different answer because it's a statistical process. It's not a predefined response that this LLM is going to give to you. So I don't see the difference in responses being the issue. I think what we should be striving for is that the approximation of the answer is as correct as possible. So you provide as much accurate data into the training of your model, and you see where it's going wrong, you monitor where it's going wrong so that you can then improve it the next time. That's obviously the only way in which you could make an LLM as truthful as possible, and there will always be multiple versions of the truth. So I think the challenge is more about who are you catering for, what's your user, what's your audience, and how are they responding to the truth of that model.
A little bit from practical way of view, we're having these foundation models, and there are a lot of money coming to train these models, and then you have to tune or fine-tune the models. And this stage, then you would have perhaps to employ different cultures, different approaches, or different enterprises or wishes, what they would have to have as a result. So you're putting this gate, so through fine-tuning gate, actually the question is coming, and you have a gate, you check, is it ethical or not? Then it's go to this foundation model, and on the outcome, we would have some answers, and they are the second gate or filter that you are filtered again, and you are receiving these answers. And these both gates, or perhaps many different could be, you could imagine different these gates, and there you can put different biases or specificities of your enterprise or your use cases.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of echo what Leslie was saying. I don't personally think having a different response in, let's say, different locations or for different people is necessarily a bad thing. In fact, a lot of us strive to add personalization into chatbots and conversational AI systems. So, you know, if I was deploying a chatbot across 4 different countries, I probably wouldn't have the same responses word for word even in each of those countries, because the way people interact, conversational expectations are all going to differ. So for me, as long as the core facts that are being provided in the answer, as long as they are correct, and how we test and measure that is potentially another topic, but as long as the facts coming out of it are correct, I think it not being necessarily, you know, word for word exactly the same, maybe not such a big problem.
I think it might be an interesting side project if anyone's looking to build some sort of Wikipedia of large language models where anyone can contribute, like certain questions, certain expected responses, levels of depth that any company can then run their language model through. It's kind of like a crowdsourced testing set of data that might be a way to see how you can take into account different cultures, different languages, different perspectives on certain topics, and just grow that substantially, and maybe even force the Microsofts, the Googles to contribute to those data sets or crowdsourced questions or responses.
You could see it as sort of like a sort of driving test for bias in that sort of scenario. That's just a really novel, interesting sort of thing. As a shout out to Microsoft, you know, I've been using Copilot recently, and do you know what? I'm genuinely impressed that it does cite resources at the bottom, which is quite good. I can then go and do further read on it as well, which is always handy.
Small addition, we have to take into consideration also time. Our human biases changes with the time. So if we are now have these biases, it's possible there would be different biases in the future. We have to also just think about this time aspect.
Yeah, it comes back to Leslie's point of don't ship and forget. It's exactly the same thing. So we've seen it in a few different presentations here at Chatbot Europe of the Gartner hype cycle, showing that Gen AI and LLMs are just about to plummet into the trough of disillusionment. Given that, yes, it'll probably be accelerated more than some other technologies just because of the hype involved at the minute and the cash flowing around. But in that time spent in the trough, what could we be doing from a pragmatic point of view to sort of get the even self-regulation, especially around bias in this space? What practical things, you know, should companies be doing, or individuals or people working in AI be doing in that time period to both keep hype up so they don't lose customers, but also ship better products?
So I think it's all about doing, it depends who you're talking to, right? Like on the regulation side of things, the goal should always be to regulate technologies that is beneficial for society. I think the iteration loop of regulation is a bit too slow at the moment. So it would be great to kind of bring that more iterative process into regulation as well. But for that, you need access to the data. So one thing that I would suggest governments to do is to maybe build data sets that they train, that you can test LLMs that their society is using on to ensure that they are not being misled in any way before they're allowed to be, I mean, it becomes a little bit controlling of a government, I guess, at that point, but there's some balance to be struck between giving total freedom to technology to restricting it in such a way that you end up in some totalitarian state. So I think finding that balance and using real data from real users to determine where the balance currently is and how to improve the balance is probably the best way forward. But yeah, that requires a very different skill set in government than is currently in most governments.
Yeah, I would add, I think even as we go into the trough, we know that we are going to sort of peak back out again. So it would be foolish, I think, for us to kind of become lax during that trough and not try and predict or at least anticipate what might happen as we get that curve back up. And sort of, as we've kind of touched on already, like a lot of that information we think about how we can mitigate bias and improve the models is going to come from the data, but we might not get actually a lot of that live data until we're going back up the curve again and we've got these live deployments. So I think for me it's sort of important that during this time we're maybe looking more at how can we fund additional research into bias in LLMs, particularly how we identify it and how we mitigate it. And we were chatting yesterday, Svetlana, about even the idea of, well, how do we know what bias we're even looking for? Like, have we got a methodology that we can use to classify that bias so that we're actually pulling out and identifying everything we need to then go ahead and mitigate it? So I think there's a lot of research that can still be done during this period of time to maybe try and get us some answers before we start to go back up that curve again, and just try and get a bit ahead of the game. And then I think for, you know, a lot of people who are working in companies, it sounds quite simple and it's not very techy, but I actually think something we can all be doing is looking a bit internally and questioning our own biases, because we're all going to be working on this technology, and as we've said, it inherently reflects the bias we have as a society. So kind of checking ourselves, thinking about, well, questioning a little bit, what do I think? Is there a bias in there? Do I need to be looking at this from a different angle so that when you get to the point of design, development, implementation, you maybe have a bit more of a well-rounded view of it. You've fostered a really diverse team, and you've sort of had those conversations before we get to a point where everyone's like, quick, let's press the go button and send it out to the public.
If you again think about implementation, just check whether there already exists model that could possible check these biases, that you don't have to again to investigate or to program this on yourself, and or for some of our customer, or just this project that we made with small businesses, and we again used there is possibility that just you were able to check in case these kind of questions are coming, then you would automatically put this answer, and so you already on this level you were now already able to delay these possible questions that you don't want to have, or these possible biases. Just think about the structure, make the list that you wouldn't like to have, and then check the models or whether they already have this possibility to easy for no-code programmer to implement this.
So now for the question that none of you are expecting, because we talked about questions before. Right? I, last week, asked ChatGPT-4 to read an NIST report in ethics in AI and generate me a question. And you know what? It's actually quite good. So, this is what it came up with. If society develops effective methods for identifying and mitigating unintended biases in AI systems, how can we ensure that these methods are accessible to all AI practitioners? I think Rachel's going to answer this one.
I'll try and start, and then someone else can jump in and add their 2 cents. So I think, for me, it's actually a really important point, I think, because if we develop these methods, they've got to be available to everyone, or we're going to end up with some communities who potentially have this, really great high-performing AI, and then potentially other communities who are left a little bit behind because they don't have access to it. So I think if we manage to develop and completely eradicate, I mean, it's a very positive outcome GPT's looking at there, it probably does have some place in regulation, so that it is sort of, I don't necessarily know like mandated, but there's at least clear guidelines that everyone's following to try and level the playing field. And then I think there would probably need to be some level of open source element to whatever we are doing to identify and mitigate that bias. I don't think it can be sort of gate-kept by just the big tech companies. We don't necessarily all have to use the same algorithm or the same product, but maybe the fundamentals behind that need to be shared more widely so that everyone can utilize that knowledge and implement it within their own their own tools.
I think at the moment this should track your position on the world, track your social status, your gender, and then give you the corresponding answer.
Is this the last question, or can I?
It is the last question, yeah.
So I would say it might be an interesting idea to think of a new type of standard, like not the ISO standard, but the TMI standard. There's never too much information, but did you test, monitor, and iterate your model? That could be an interesting approach to force companies to go through before they are allowed to deploy some LLM with the stamp of approval. So that could be one approach to make sure that not only the knowledge is spread, but also that companies know, oh, this is the right approach to deploy these kind of models. And then in the end, yeah, the data is where the truth lies in the end. So I think like shared data sets that people can use to test their performance, to understand where their models are failing, that are crowdsourced, is probably the best approach to gather an as diverse as possible source of truths that you might want to test any LLM on.
I spent a lot of time in aviation, and the aviation regulations are an interesting sort of set of like IATA guidance. And I think what Rachel was saying is actually it's pretty similar to how aviation's set up, in the sense that, you know, every airline and operator has their own, you know, tight, close sort of things and operations. But there's a standard, there's a set of standards that are generated and created by the community, but overseen by effectively a UN body. I think that would be quite an interesting sort of way of implementing that.
Yeah, leave it with me.
So my question now is there any questions from the audience for the panel? Oh, we've got one down the front. Excellent.
We have been discussing mostly the role of the solution providers or the model providers in reducing bias. What do you think will be the role of the user to reduce bias?
I think that's a really good question, actually. I'm not sure how much responsibility we should or can put on the end user in reducing that bias. I think when we put out our conversational AI systems to the world, we're sort of inviting users to interact with them however they sort of want. And you tend to see when people interact with something like a chatbot, they kind of want to break it, and they'll ask it horrible questions, and they'll say horrible things to it, because we kind of want to see what it does when it goes wrong, or try and break it. So yeah, I don't know that I have a set answer. I think it's a really interesting question, how much responsibility we can put on an end user, because it doesn't feel right to me putting guidelines in place for how a user can talk to our solutions. That feels too restrictive. So yeah.
I think the use case, I don't know who's attended the Dutch police talk, but that was a great example where it didn't want to help a user anymore as soon as they were being inappropriate, but secretly they were still going to help if they actually had a real issue. So I think building in those guardrails to, one, not let end users abuse a certain technology in a way that it wasn't intended to be built for, is one thing. And the second thing is that's the only feedback you're going to get. Like any LLM you will release will be having an impact on users or will be used by users. So I think that's the core, that's the real truth. That's where you're going to find out where things are going wrong, where things are going right. So it might not be putting the responsibility with the end user, but it's the best feedback you will ever get on the performance of that technology.
In a sentence, what's your view on that question?
This is what I was to ask. From my perspective, I was thinking more about the feedback mechanisms that you can give to the users that would allow them, when they see any misbehavior of the chatbots or imagination tools, they can report that, so that we are aware that the problem is happening. And so do you think that the current feedback options that we give to the user, simply giving a thumb up, thumb down kind of feedback is sufficient to report these deep problems of bias? Do we need more different ways for feedback?
Perhaps first you need a little bit to classify your biases. So if you think about first step, just try to classify, and then depending on what kind of biases you would have also different solutions. And then if you have this classification for your business, try to put different solutions. Think about different solutions and corresponding then different answers or connecting them to different services.
I'm going to end on a little bit of audience participation. So I want hands up if you use please and thank you when talking to ChatGPT. It's about half. That's really interesting. For the people that kept their hands down, be more polite. You know, these systems are going to take your jobs. Right, that's it for us. I'm going to hand back to the moderator.
Who else has a question?
Ooh. Have we got time for more questions?
Yeah.
Oh, all right.
Oh, excellent. So I have a lot, but I will follow up with each of you with my questions. But first, this is for Rachel. You mentioned a few times about examining biases as an individual who's working on these things. And for me, I work in policy, and it's very easy for me to recommend that people do things like this, like examine their biases, but self-reflection is also flawed. So knowing the biases doesn't necessarily lead to changing your behavior. So how, in practice, are you managing to do that at your company?
Yeah, so at my company, I mean, we have a lot of internal resourcing and learning that is around helping us to identify our own internal bias, but it doesn't sort of finish at getting to that point of where you think, oh, yeah, I've identified those biases. There's a lot of emphasis put on how we're taking actionable steps to change those. So, like, personally in my work life, like, when you set goals within the workplace, for example, like we have specific diversity inclusion goals that we all set where they're based around what our potential biases are or how we can personally contribute to a more diverse and inclusive workplace. So as a company, we place a lot of emphasis on the workforce, on the employees, not only of kind of being aware of the biases, but actually doing something about it. And it is hard, and I think it's really difficult conversations for a lot of people. So I would say, for other people out there who are trying to do that themselves, get comfortable with being a little bit uncomfortable and take the opportunities that you have to interact with a really diverse set of people, attend talks, whether that's through work or externally, about things that maybe you have preconceived ideas about or you don't necessarily know as much about, and learn and listen to those people's experiences and use those to, build up your own knowledge and then incorporate those in your work going forward.
Anybody else on this side? Somebody was here? I think somebody was raising their hand over here. Not anymore. All right. We have time for one more question.
Can I ask the policy lady a question? What's the most difficult challenge you've got at the minute around policy in this area?
Yeah, well, the ethical questions for sure. So right now there's a lot on AI governance and how we actually do that, and because it doesn't necessarily stay within borders, and then everybody does it differently. And so the question of sovereignty and how we all work together is really tough, because you end up with such generalized, watered down kind of recommendations that you can never really get to the specific amazing things that you all mentioned, and it kind of still puts the onus on the developers and companies. So right now, that's kind of the biggest issue I see is, and that's why I was asking about how you actually managed to do that, and I loved your response. Basically, it sounds like social change, behavior change is necessary in order to actually get things moving, and that's kind of the answer for most policy questions, I think.
I do not envy your job.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful panel trying to solve an issue that is a tough one to solve. And I imagine as time goes, we'll have more clear answers. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you.